have an incredible guest list of over 40 guests from across the world. We have guests and members from almost every continent who are expected to join us today. First and foremost, I'd also like to thank and welcome some of the senior leadership from ULI, and also in particular, thank Ed Walter, the global CEO of ULI, who's joining us for this session. Just before we kick off, any questions, you know the drill, please put them in the chat. This session will be recorded. If there is anything you do not feel comfortable sharing, please do not do so. With that in mind, I'd like to turn it over to Chris Chow. Chris is a new member of ULI who has been incredibly forward-thinking and just a great person to have collaborated with on this session. And Chris, I'm going to turn over to you and we'll kick it off.
Great. Thank you so much, Linda. And hello, ULI friends and my new GEC friends. As you remember, we had some discussion a few weeks ago about the core. What happens to core real estate in the time of COVID? And I think we all kind of agreed that we've been thinking about the whole COVID angle for quite some time. So we wanted to move beyond the simple COVID effects and think about what were the structural changes that were being accelerated in our daily lives, even beyond the COVID period. And we started to think about the core in a new way. So what were the structural changes that challenge our ideas of centrality and physical connection in general? So we all know urbanization and globalization was a big push coming into this period. Changing demographics, especially migration and aging. Certainly technology disruptions, platform systems that are constantly changing our idea about centrality, and finally climate change. So at least 4 big structural changes that are accelerating. But if consumers follow behaviors, how are new behaviors and these new structural changes shifting our fundamental ideas about what it means to be core? And how do they shift our ideas about value at the level of an office, at the level of any built asset, at the level of cities? Or how about urban regions? Or what about the broader territory? And do these new behaviors suggest reworkings of our social contracts? And if there are changes, ultimately, what are the implications for what we are thinking about urban land and core real estate? So those are kind of the big ideas that have been knocking around in the back of our mind. And for today, I can't think of 3 more interesting people to talk to this about. They're all friends of ULI. They're also good personal friends and people who've contributed to our discussions over time. What we're gonna do is we're gonna invite Parag Khanna in a minute to talk to us a little bit. And then we're gonna invite 2 others, and I'll introduce them separately, to respond to what Parag has presented to us. And then hopefully we have a chance to open up the discussion to the broader group that's on the call. So if you are if you're having deep thoughts and you want to start sharing them with us in the form of a question in particular, please make sure you put your questions into the chat so we can get around to them. So first, we're gonna ask Parag to share some of his thoughts with us. So Parag, super interesting guy. I probably learn more from Parag than just about anybody else I know. He's the founder and managing partner of Future Map, which is a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm. I think he's super smart. Wired magazine put him on their smart list. He was on Esquire's 75 most influential people of the 21st century. I don't think too many of us on this call are part of that. Parag has written some amazing books, and I'm just going to read you a few of the titles. A recent one, The Future is Asian: Commerce, Conflict, and Culture in the 21st Century. Another one, Technocracy in America: The Rise of the Info State. or How to Run the World, Charting a Course to the Next Renaissance, and my personal favorite, Connectography, which is about mapping the future of global civilization. And it goes on and on and on. This man is prolific. Anyway, Parag, we're going to turn the floor over to you for a few minutes, and then we'll chat a little bit afterwards.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris, for that generous introduction. And you know that the feeling is mutual. I think of you very much as a philosopher in the field of urbanization and cities. You've taught me a lot, and a lot of what's gone into those books you've mentioned has come out from our conversations, both just individually and then in the context of ULI. And as you said, all of us here today are, as the speakers, are very good friends of ULI. I've always enjoyed the conversations, large and small, that have taken place at ULI events. So thank you, and thank you, Linda, for bringing us all together. So I'm so excited for this conversation that I do want to jump right in. And Chris, the way you kick things off with already some sort of philosophical remarks around how do we define the core at all? It's not to be taken for granted. So I want to, in a way, one up from what you said and really use it as a point of departure very, very literally, because this conversation wouldn't be fun if it weren't challenging. And a direct corollary to what you said is really the title question or the issue that I raise in my slide. So, new core, scenarios for the future of human geography. What does that mean? In the most layman's possible terms, following on what you said, Chris, the core is where the people are. However, we're moving into a future where we can't be so sure where the people are. And I really want everyone to hold that in your head, not only for the next hour, but really for the decades of your professional life that lie ahead, because we are moving into a new kind of phase, if you will, of human geography, in which we are not necessarily as sedentary as we have been the last few centuries. It doesn't mean the so-called death of the city, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it does mean that we have to rethink the intersection of human geography and urban geography. So let me make a few observations. The first relates to the last couple of years of disruptions and crises that have disrupted our markets. And I take as a case in point exactly 1 year ago when COVID broke out. And you may remember people saying, people are staying at home, we're not using public transportation, we're quarantining, suddenly the skies are clear in New Delhi, and this kind of thing. And maybe COVID and is the sort of solution to climate change, right? If we all just stay locked down, we'll clear the climate. Then, of course, we had nonetheless the forest fires in Sydney, forest fires in California, and so forth. And now we have the economic calamity, and we have the technology of remote work, and so on. So we have these many different disruptions at the same time. Punchline here: you do not get to pick your crisis. Right? We so often talk about these trends in isolation: an environmental challenge, a COVID and epidemiological challenge, economic challenges, political challenges, technological challenges, as if they do not interrelate and impact each other in ways that we literally do not necessarily perceive in an active way. So we have to be much more holistic. And I'm giving you tangible examples here. Anyone could say, yes, let's be holistic and interdisciplinary. But the last 1 year has proven that you cannot neatly segment these issues. And therefore, I want to reinforce again the point that we cannot predict the future of human geography only by looking at telecommuting, or only by looking at climate change, or only looking at people's search for less population density, and so on and so forth. It's all of these things, and each of those things affects each other in ways that you may not immediately predict. So I'm going to jump across some of these different variables and maybe take them sequentially, but then build a kind of composite picture of what it might mean. So let's take a headline. I love it when very recent headlines support the point. There's long-term trends, short-term signals. Here's an example of the short-term signals pointing in the wrong direction. So climate change will make parts of the US uninhabitable. Americans are still moving there because people move for one reason at one point in time and may move for another reason at another point in time, right? So for example, of course, Financial professionals in New York may be moving to Miami because the tax rate is 0, whereas some years later on, they may be moving to another state for another reason. Similarly, a lot of Americans have been moving to Texas, but if you read this same reportage or series of reports from Publica, you could have swells of climate migrants moving north from Central America into Texas. What will that mean for the people in Texas who may no longer want to be in Texas, right? So think about a future in which there are multiple moves and multiple times for multiple directions. That's the kind of future we might be headed into. So this reconfiguration of the world, human geography and economy owes itself to many factors, but what are some of the current, let's say, short to medium term drivers that might start to indicate future patterns of residence and business and so forth? Well, one is the immediate one, COVID-19, right? People looking for countries or geographies, states that had a lower COVID casualty count, better healthcare, more hospital beds, this kind of thing. Governments, local, municipal, state that they may trust more, these kinds of things. Remote work, obviously, and everyone will hear different statistics and projections about this. It was 4% before the pandemic. It could be 40% some years from now. We'll see what percentage it is. It doesn't matter what the overall percentage is as much as what the new geographies are that attract those populations that are now working remotely. Retirement. We have 80 million in the United States, 80 million baby boomers, obviously far more than that number in Europe, needing to, given longer life expectancy and longevity, needing to stretch their savings out and look for affordable places. Then climate change, as mentioned, and it's of course many different climate variables in different places. It could be the forest fires, sea level rise, flooding, and so forth. And then, of course, the economic implications of all of this, the distressed assets and the need for a certain, again, a sort of rehabilitation of certain areas or abandonment of certain areas, as we've seen, of course, in particular, over the last 15 to 20 years in the United States. Briefly about technology, we're on Zoom right now, so I don't think that a lot of this needs explanation, only to say that the scope of digitization is much more than just communications, right? It is logistics, it is e-commerce, it is entertainment, it is education, and it is finance. It is all of those things at the same time, all of them accelerating. And this is just a partial list of some of the firms or technologies that are driving these changes. Never underestimate our social or even individual ability to embrace technologies that we did not hear of yesterday. Right? In fact, we do. We do it all the time. So a great acceleration is certainly underway. And you've heard this story already, I'm sure, many times over the past year, that technological deployment has accelerated at a scale that would have taken many, many years to get to absent this pandemic. So that's obviously going to change patterns of human geography again. So what constitutes the kind of settled geography, a place where a quote unquote new core might emerge where it isn't today? And let me reinforce again this point. When people say, because I'm sure, especially in your business and industry, you've been invited to many conversations titled "Wither the City," or is it the death of the city? And when people have those conversations, it's as if they only conjure up New York City, right? And it is the barometer and the proxy for the future of all cities. And it's not, because 7,000 years of human history is actually, in some ways, a competition among cities, right? So the decline of one city doesn't mean the decline of all cities. It's always about the movement of people between them and breathing new life and vitality and setting the stage for the growth of other cities. And in my work, I give plenty of examples going back literally thousands of years. But to just take an obvious one, it is the rise of Dubai from the if you will, sort of accelerated by the collapse of Lebanon during their civil war that began in the late 1970s and 1980s. So talent migration out of one place, absorbed by another place. And as we have a plateauing of the world population, I haven't put a slide on this here because it's a bit, a bit of a sort of side topic for the moment. But as you may well know, and Chris did mention demographics at the beginning, this is an inflection point, the likes of which we haven't actually seen in recorded memory, right? The world population is plateauing at roughly 9 to 9.5 billion people. The pandemic has significantly accelerated the baby bust, the global fertility decline that was already underway. In fact, if you haven't heard this yet, you heard it here first. It could well be that Generation Alpha, which is today's sort of toddlers, who have yet to fully be born because we measure Generation Alpha as ending in the year 2025, it is likely that Generation Alpha will not be as large as Generation Z. Now, this utterly rips up generations of demographic forecasting, because we tend to have each generational increment, baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, be roughly 200 to 300 million people larger than the previous cohort. We are literally about to, in the year 2025, in January 1, 2026, we will know how many Gen Alpha children were born in that phase. And it's going to wind up being less than Gen Z. So that is literally the kind of species level, world historical inflection point, and the world population is very manifestly going to begin to plateau and even decline in all of the lifetimes of everyone on this call. So this is pretty significant, and I give all of that as a segue into this point around, if people wanted to, it's going to be a world of geographic arbitrage, right? Aging countries will be looking for younger people are looking for stable geographies, even as they may be moving around between them. What is going to constitute a sort of a livable habitat, a desirable place to be? So that's something that I've been investigating, and I've been using as a proxy the value of land, right? To look at where people are going there and what are the factors that drive a sort of a sentiment towards a place. So we call it climate oases, but it's actually much more interdisciplinary. We've been gathering a wide range of variables about each particular geography, county level in the case of the United States, and trying to do the same for other parts of the world. So the climate variables are straightforward: the temperature, the precipitation, the groundwater availability, many of these kinds of factors. Education has historically been a very strong proxy or correlating factor to the value of land. Proximity to good transportation systems, healthcare, socioeconomic in terms of course, per capita income of a place, tax rates, and good, stable energy supply. And as we've looked at these, we have found it to be non-linear. And I want to really emphasize one point and a corollary here. The first is that when we try to forecast the future value of land based on the last 20 to 30 years of data, we find that most factors are relatively stationary, right? In other words, climate, for example, has not played a very big role in determining the value of land. I think we can safely say that that is not going to be true of the next 10 years or next 20 years. So in other words, in terms of statistics, climate is a non-stationary variable. In other words, we have not taken it seriously. We need to take it seriously. Another example is when it comes to energy. There are places that have abundant solar power potential, but they would rank relatively low in their land value today because we have assessed the value of land based upon the proximity to existing energy assets, right? It could be electricity grids, hydrocarbon energy, but in a future in which renewable technology is easily deployable anywhere, actually that should not be the historical metric should not be the one we use to assess the value of that land. It should actually be the capacity of that geography to generate its own energy for its residents. So another example of a non-stationary variable. And these are just some of the nuances within these different categories. And yet, again, they all intersect and affect each other in very complicated ways that we've been trying to statistically sort of play out. A few more points. So if we look at the US now, again, this is sort of a climate driven. We've been hearing this term climate niche. And of course, the shifting climate niche that is quite different from what mankind has enjoyed in terms of predictable latitudes. over the last several thousands of years versus what lies ahead. So this sort of elevated indented area towards the north, straddling the US-Canada border, more or less is more of the climate oasis, if you will, within the United States. Now, obviously, as you well know, this is not where the main population centers, or many of the main population centers of the US are not within this climate niche. Secondly, to reinforce the point I made at the beginning about the zigzagging nature of human geography, you see at the bottom I've mentioned the Great Lakes and the Inner Atlantic. Well, these are geographies within the US that have been losing populations. And yet, as you see here, they are squarely within the climate niche. So you can very well imagine a repopulation of the Great Lakes region, of the Rust Belt, for entirely new economic purposes, of course, in the coming years. So in other words, places that have been abandoned by the past generation could easily be reclaimed by the next one when we think about these things in sort of complexity terms. Now let me spread out to the global level, last couple of points. Today's precise human geography. Chris, I know you recognize this map from Connectography. This is one of my favorites because it's difficult to pixelate, to kind of get every single human being in the world as a pixel on this map, but we did it. And we've got the population densities and so forth. So the question one needs to answer when trying to decide or divine what is the new core, say, well, here is where everyone on Earth is today. And in the ovals, you have the mega cities, the most populous clusters of cities in the world. I call them archipelagos because it's really not just little black dots on a map, right? Chongqing, Chengdu as a cluster is not a dot, right? It has the population of Germany. And the same is true of some of these other clusters. So what might be the new clusters, the next clusters? And this is actually in the next couple of slides, I'll be giving you sort of a sneak preview of some work I'm doing for a future book. But let's get back to this, people moving from red zones to blue zones. Again, broadly, if you want to answer the question, what is the future human geography, you should first step back and ask why people move in the first place. Why does anyone move ever? And I find that there's 6 reasons historically, and I don't just mean the last year, I mean literally historically, why people move. For example, the last 75 years, by far the largest driver of human migration has been demographic imbalances and labor shortages. In other words, young people filling labor gaps in older countries, right? This explains Latin American populations in the United States. It explains Turks into Western Europe and so on. Then you have political crises, so it could be civil wars, genocide, state failure, this kind of thing. Economic crises, obviously, I mentioned the resorting of the American population that kicked off after 2008. Remember, in Europe, it was relatively similar. You had Southern Europeans moving to Northern Europe, right? You had Italians and Greeks and Balkan populations moving upward as well. So a mix of the politics and the economics. Labor automation fits in really with economic crises as well. People being negatively dislocated as their jobs are lost and they're made redundant and need to move to other places, or positively in the sense that you can now be a remote worker, live anywhere, go wherever you want. And then climate change as discussed, and of course the pandemic. Now, I showed you the climate niche for the United States earlier. This is, if you will, the climate niche for the world, though, caveat, this is an extreme scenario. Here, what you see is the New Scientist, British journal. It's their rendition of the geography of food production if global temperatures rise 4 degrees Celsius from the 1990 IPCC baseline. Now, we're not at 4 degrees Celsius yet, but Bill Gates, and among others, worries that we could be heading in that direction. So I think that we should take it relatively seriously as a scenario. Now, this does not happen overnight. We don't flick a switch and the whole world south of the Canadian and Russian border becomes desertified. That's not how it works. These are gradual transitions. However, with that in mind, that's precisely what we see happening when we witness the droughts across West Asia and South Asia, Australia, even Brazil, and the United States. So today's largest food producing countries are experiencing what scientists do call mega droughts. What are people looking for as they move? And if you're going to design a habitat, a city, whatever the case may be, you want to keep in mind, people are looking for food security, sustainability, fresh water supply, circular economy, meaning sustainable, upcycling, quality healthcare, stable employment, friendliness to migrants, and of course, affordability. I would say that this may seem like a generic list, but I want to emphasize one thing. In my recent research of the last couple of years, I've tried to focus entirely on the preferences of young people. I've honed in on a particular demographic, which is global youth, which is about 4 billion people. And let me just say, the young, they are not like you and me, to use that famous quote. And I mean this very literally, because if you want to understand what the largest demographic of people in the world is, it isn't two income baby boomer suburban households with 2 kids and 2 cars in the garage. And it isn't even just, people in China. The largest demographic in the world is actually young, single, childless, so unmarried, urban youth, right? Who are financially insecure, right? If you want to understand the sort of future, this is the lump of human beings that you have to plan for literally the future of the human species, and you wanted to summarize them in one sentence, you would not describe them the way we just probably describe ourselves, right? Again, young, single, childless, financially struggling in cities somewhere. That's literally the largest demographic of human beings. And that's the one that I'm focused on because they are your future market and they're literally the demographic future of the world. And this is what they're looking for. And this is based upon all of the public and individual kinds of surveys and research that I've been doing. Again, global climate niche seen here in slightly more nuanced detail. Now, this is maybe some secret intel I'm providing you. This is adapted from my next book. So you're literally the first people to ever see these couple of maps here that are still being fine-tuned and rendered. In black are, existing cities that sort of everyone knows and can name. And the sort of gray patches, what I've been looking for around the world is what are the microclimates and likely stable geographies that are capable of, if you will, amassing or taking on more, greater human habitation, a larger number of people, absorbing migrants of many kinds. It doesn't have to be climate migrants. It doesn't have to be desperate refugees, voluntary migrants looking and planning ahead for, relatively stable places. Again, they could be, whether they're politically stable or not, environmentally stable or not. I'm trying to look at the different inputs and factors for places that are potentially could be sources for larger scale human settlement than they are today. And these are the ones I've identified. And I've been to all of them. I have chapters about all of them actually in my next book. And there's a story, if you will, to each of them. And I've also named them according to province or region here. So we can obviously deep dive into this further. But let me just make a final couple of points. When you look at this from an economic standpoint, one of the things I've tried to do is to disaggregate countries, right? We generalize too much about countries as a whole, but the truth is that especially large countries are highly uneven. So I've tried to look at what are the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, if you will, geographies within certain countries, if it's a large country like the US or Canada. And you can obviously see the variability there in the United States, or even in an area like the European Union, what are the places that have a higher or lower median income? So these are the sort of tier 1 and tier 2 geographies globally in terms of where you see an overlap of incomes, political stability, and so forth. So again, stripping out the climate variable for a moment. So let me just stop right there because I wanted to end on that very specific note of actual geographies that might be worth debating. In addition, obviously, to stepping back and hearing your thoughts on the macro influences on our future human geography. Thank you.
Thanks, Parag. And this is why you are the world's most favorite dinner guest. And we hope we get to have some more meals with you soon. You did a magnificent gallop, and my favorite thing about all of this is a term which is probably not something that we grew up with, but the idea of human geography. That somehow there's a universe and a place that's not bounded by space, but it has to do with human potential. You talked about the disruptions, the simultaneous disruptions that are taking place. Our endless referenda on whether the city is over or not, and is a disruption climate related, economically related, pandemic related. and you made the good point, is that we don't get to choose our disruptions. We just have to react to them to a certain extent, but possibly gain some sort of insight about how population groups may think of their own future related to the disruption. You made a distinction between long-term trends and short-term signals. And of course, the value here is to think about the long-term trend, not to chase the short-term signal alone. And how all of these trends tend to reconfigure both population and economy. And then you started to bring us to this idea of a settled geography that is less bounded by ideas of nation or sort of 19th century protection versus marauders or anything like that, but it's something related to the climate and the climate oasis. So settled geography and climate oasis, and pointing out that there's an inflection point, and we're soon upon it. And we will all be cast into this search for opportunity, and talent will tend to go to where these places have both other people like us, and also other people that can receive the talent that's searching for the opportunity. And you talked about the value of land. And then you closed on this idea of kind of like the characteristic of the largest cohort that may be seeking this opportunity or fleeing the disruption. And you talked about the global youth, 4 billion people, and suggesting that the opportunities lie not so much in cities versus non-cities, but cities that are part of this climate oasis structure. That's probably the biggest disruption. It's the reaction to the biggest disruption coming up. Okay, so some friends on the call. So if you start having some questions, start putting them into the chat. A couple of quick questions. If we are living in a world of nation states for the moment, but the world doesn't really care about nations, it is caring more about cities and city regions than nations, or more importantly, flows that are extra-national or extra-urban. How do we set, or how do we think of governance in this kind of age? How do we define a social contract that in some way can get some kind of traction on this kind of change? What do you think?
Great question. So, I mean, with most of the world population being urbanized in some way, shape, or form, and having these very large mega city clusters, which is very much obviously a 20th century and now 21st century phenomenon, you could safely say that city and city regions are the core, to use that term in a different context, really the core of any nation anyway, right? And what, the map I showed you with the 8 billion pixels was also showing that by far the largest share of any national economy is its leading 1 or 2 cities, very, very often, especially in emerging markets, especially in the most populous, many of the most populous countries of the world. So even if we never remove or transcend the single border, even if we add more borders to the world in the years ahead, we will still live in a world where cities and city regions are the economic drivers, and the connectivity and the flows between them, ultimately the drivers of which societies succeed or fail, or which economies succeed or fail. So in terms of social contract, then, what you find very often, this contrasts, or in a way this is runs in parallel to the fiscal stress that is felt at the federal level in all but a few countries of the world. Very heavy indebtedness, tax rates already, either as high or as they can be or are going to go, and therefore a growing fiscal devolution. In other words, fiscal devolution is a very polite way of saying you're on your own, right? Whether you're a city or a province, coming up with their own solution. And hence you see within countries as well as across them, we're very accustomed to a competition for investment across countries, but within the United States, within across Indian provinces, there's an intense competition to draw in investment in business. Obvious example from the US context, Amazon had HQ too, right? That isn't actually new. It was just sexier than what's been happening for more than a decade with between states like Tennessee and Kentucky to attract European or Korean or Japanese car manufacturers, right? So there is this intense competition within countries, and that's part of this devolution. It's not that the federal government absorbs all FDI revenue and equitably apportions it across the country. No, nothing of the sort. So we already live in a fairly radically devolved world in which cities, city regions, states, provinces are doing their own thing, and the state provides a certain degree of services. And even then, Chris, I would just caution, of course, since we have the good fortune of being a global conversation here, this very notion of the state and the nation state, again, it's as real as ever legally, but functionally, we can't with a straight face pretend that all states are like Germany or like China, right? Because the vast majority of them are not. The metaphor that I reach for time and time again is the Middle Ages, right? It really is the Middle Ages. It's a very uneven landscape. In some places, you have a strong state. In others, it's just about the city-state. In others, it's chaos and anarchy. At the end of the day, as everyone on this call should know, and in a way be heartened to have this message reinforced, it always comes back to the city, right? I'll say it, I said it before, I'll say it again. We've had cities for 7,000 years. Cities have witnessed empires, civilizations, nations rise, fall, come, and go. We'll always have the city. I'm not too, I've witnessed already in our lifetimes, countries collapse. The city is still there.
Great, that's great. And keeping that in mind, I'd like to introduce now two people who more than a lot of people I know really love cities. We're going to pick on them as kind of the first wave of response to what you're presenting. First of all, Koen van Ostrom. So Bill Clinton called Koen the Steve Jobs of sustainability. He's the CEO of Edge Technologies. He's a real estate developer, and he specializes in producing these extraordinary and innovative buildings that are enabled by sustainable technologies. Started in Rotterdam, but then moved off into Germany, and now is in London, Boston, New York. And then also another good friend, Sean Chow. So you probably heard of AECOM, world's premier engineering firm. And Sean is the global business line chief of the part of AECOM that's really the most strategic part, which we call buildings and places. He's also based in Asia. He used to run AECOM's Asian business, and now he's focusing on this very, very specialized role. So now, Koen, maybe you and then Sean, what do you think about Parag's messages? Anything that jumps out at you or anything that sort of relates to your own experience?
Well, I find it super interesting, and I think it's on a level where we as real estate developers don't always want to go, especially such a very long-term view is often difficult to bring together with the, let's say, the more short-term view that we experience all around us with elected officials having like a 4-year horizon, and also with investors often now, well, maybe looking 10 years ahead, but with private equity around us, it's often more like 5 years ahead. And so I'm super happy that we have this conversation. I must say that also Bill Clinton once called me a big optimist, and I am a little bit of an optimist. I think I have to be because I'm based in Amsterdam, and one of the little red stripes on the map, which I think meant that it's going to be on the water, is of course the Netherlands, which is basically one big delta and will be well below sea levels for a long time. And I am a little bit of an optimist when it comes to technology and when it comes to where I think if you see all the work that's being done at the moment, when it comes to carbon capture and storage, when it comes to building a big green wall in Africa, when it comes to so many other things like climate adaptation. There was a big climate adaptation initiative in The Hague in the last week, where a lot of countries got together. And if you look at the Dutch with all their water systems, also helping New York at the moment to reinvent how to store water when there's a high sea level, then of course 4 degrees will be a major change, but maybe it will also be a change which will affect some regions a lot more than other regions, because some regions might be able to cope with it and might be able to have a strategy. The Dutch think that they can keep out many increases, maybe even up to 1 or 2 meters of water increase, and the big difficulty will be in a delta to get the river water pumped into the sea. It's not so much keeping the sea out, it's the water that flows through Germany and France into the Netherlands to manage that waterway. What I find super interesting here is that talking about core, and my first reflex is that it's core real estate. And what we see in the core real estate market is mainly that everybody wants to prevent exactly this prediction of the future. And we see a lot of investment in what we will now call core real estate, which is future-proof, core and future-proof. It is now being called, and huge investments in signing up to Paris-proof buildings. And Paris-proof buildings then are almost energy neutral, are circular, and there's a lot of thinking around that. And I'm pretty positive that at least from the real estate angle, there's so many things that we can do. What I find interesting is what will be the economic effect of everything that we've heard today. And this information about Generation Alpha is something that was new for me. I try to follow a little bit myself, for example, what is going to happen with inflation in the next years? What is the effect of so many older people using their pensions when it comes to the amount of money that is flowing around in the world? Will we have economic growth? Will we have will we have shortages of labor? Or will we actually have an excess of labor with AI coming on? And there seems to be so many different trends that have different effects on economics. And I think economics are going to be the driver for what is going to happen in these cities. Are these cities indeed going to be successful, or are we going to have new wars? Because with such a huge transformation of landscape cities, there will be migration flows, and there will be a very different perspective. A last thing I want to say is what really touched me is I think that everybody now with COVID is thinking about this social contract that is out there. I find that super interesting, and I think that if you want to have a social contract, you need to have underlying values that you share. And with all the migration flows, the question is going to be: are those values are going to be shared, or will everybody want to build a wall and keep the other people out? And can we build as a world a sort of a combined set of values and making sure that we take care of everybody, also the people that might live in a delta or in a desert that can't cope with all the changes, although the technology is available, the money is available in other parts of the world. Super interesting debate on that point. Thank you.
So Koen, you're an optimist, even though you're Dutch, which is a good thing to think about. You do have faith in technology being able to mitigate some of these effects. You do share the sentiment that we do think about core real estate to a certain extent, but you have also introduced me to a new concept, which is Paris-proof building. So how can you develop assets that are in a way trying to insulate themselves from the kind of predictions we've been hearing about? And then you made a good point that you can't really have a social contract unless you have underlying values, and that in turn implies some kind of shared experience. Okay, Sean, so you're in Asia right now. You're sitting in Asia just like Parag is right now. You are part of a business that is really focused not on building buildings, but creating systems that respond to all of this. And you are also on mute. So before, I want to hear what you have to say, but what do you think about Parag?
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you, Linda and Chris. I thought Parag's conversation, always, as usual, we invite Parag to our leadership conference as well, and it's one of our very, very popular, well-liked speaker. And every time he put up some new materials, and then again today, I'm very inspired by his content, and particularly I think, and then also I may have some questions for him as well, because I have been practicing. I trained as architect, but I'm more interested in more like a placemaking or related to urban design, land development, from green to brownfield development. I think particularly interested to me is, again, like Chris yourself, is human geography and urban geography, and is how these two things find a balance, and who is driving the movement, in the future, particularly in the future after the pandemic situation, after this core, to come up with the new core. To me, and of course, the people always, particularly in Asia, the rising middle class, they're always pursuing or chasing after a better quality of life. That's how people drive their future life. But I think we need to very carefully examine. So I mean, after the pandemic, what do that mean, particularly in people's mind? What is a better quality of life after the pandemic, when people going through this such a difficult time? And then different country has facing different situations, So and then particularly is when we talk about Generation Alpha, for those urban youth, and for those people, young, single, childless, no child, and then financial unstable. What's in their mind is a better quality of a life, and how can we provide a better quality of life, or affordable better quality of life to them? I think that's very important. I think we may need to look into the situation is very different for developed country, or developing country, or underdeveloped country, because I think the people have a different kind of a desire to pursue a so-called better quality of life. And then this is something we may dive in more, that you may need to provide different kind of situations for them to engage. The second thing is really the digital situations. We talk about the Industrial Revolution 4.0, right? I mean, that's kind of already kind of a passe already old. But we're always wondering, the first move from chapter 1 to chapter 4, I mean, chapter 1 to chapter 2 takes about 100 years. And then the next two chapters, 20 years in between, right? So how soon we're moving to Industrial Revolution chapter 5.0? Would that only take 10 years or even less? I mean, for the past year, we all noticed that our life so dramatically changed, through the digital kind of a world. Previously, we talk about the connectivities. We talk about physical connectivity, airport, ports, railways. Now we really emphasize on the digital connectivities. You have a completely different lifestyle, from shopping to entertainment to culture to education to even to future to healthcare. So this digital things, I think we need to understand or focus. Like for us, we have just in Asia with 15,000 people. Consider the rent we're paying for, and then immediately through the COVID, we reduce our rental space dramatically. We do the fit out, we do the new fit out. We start letting go our the rental space, renegotiate the rent. I think this is something, it's only part of the future lifestyle. And then the other thing is this understand or better engage with the digital situation is very, very important. Last but not least, I think Parag didn't really talk about is I'm just kind of always very curious about this political kind of situation. We know that the Trump situation kind of now, I mean, from my point of view, it's moved to a different era now. But will the political situation change people's lifestyle, or even influence how people decide where to live and where to work? This is something also can be very interesting as a part of this exercise, because particularly in Asia, or we may say Southeast Asia, our business, the most difficult challenge is geopolitical instabilities. So every time the investment direct or indirectly related to, the geopolitical situation. Who is the president? Who is the next prime minister? And then so you see the economy up and down, the environment is go up and down. So this is something maybe hard to predict, but I think we need to learn how to better manage it to become more resilient. This is some of my initial thoughts.
Great, thanks, John. So you also came back to this this great term of human geography, and it's not so much what is driving the movement, but who is driving the movement. The rising middle class in Asia, in particular, you have it in between India and China alone. Still, for the next 10, 15 years,
Yeah.
we're going to have 1 million people moving to cities every week.
That's right.
Very march of people on the move. Generation Alpha. This hypothetical being, but also how developing regions and developed regions experience this movement, both in their filling and their emptying. We talked about connectivity, physical hard connectivities like ports and airports, the increasing importance of the digital. And by the way, Parag's book on connectivity is the one that is really fascinating to read, because this is really what he's emphasizing. But then you come back again to this issue of the political context and what are the effects on all of that. Now we have some questions here, so I'm gonna just and lots of really great questions. I really apologize if we don't get to all of them ahead of time. Let's just take these as a group, and I'll read them out maybe in a cluster of questions, and between Parag and Kun and Sean. Maybe one of you can try to take a crack at it. So lots of people thanking everyone for all of this. I love this topic. Brian is saying he suspects this moment of Sunbelt optimism will literally evaporate with rising temperatures. So one question, Pulkit Sharma, what is the time horizon of this change? Less than 20 years, 20 years, 50, 100 years? Another question, is related to how, in contrast to the United States, which is quite homogeneous, a place like Chile has red, brown, and green areas, global as well as local challenges. How do we visualize the East, West, and North, South movement in this context? So I guess that question is about what happens when you have these different qualities, even within a settled body politic. So anyone want to take a crack at that? Maybe Parag, you first.
You start with the time horizon question, because the answer is now, right? We shouldn't set a date in stone and say it's in the year 2030 that suddenly 1 billion people will pick up and move. That's not the way human geography and demographics and migration work. It's a constant process. But the interesting thing is when I say now, this time I actually mean it literally, because we've just had a great global migration reset, right? December 2019 was the high point in human history for the number of people who had crossed borders in a single year. The high point in terms of the number of people living outside of their country of origin. If anything, during the year 2020, we've had a significant reset. A lot of people have gone home. South Asian migrants from the Gulf countries have gone home, for example. So the question really is what comes next? And this is actually, if you really think about it, the first time that we're running a controlled experiment on ourselves as humanity, because the lockdown was really the first time that, and it was very poorly done, of course, that all societies attempted some more or less simultaneously to conduct a single act, right, to lock down. Again, it didn't work. However, we tried. Now the question is, everything that happens next is a controlled experiment, so to speak, right? Anytime someone moves somewhere, someone allowed it, right? It happened for a reason, and we're tracking it. So it'll be so fascinating to watch the next 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. Some people moving for the same reasons they've been moving for the last 10 years, because of regular environmental catastrophes, flooding, drought, forest fires. Other people moving because they can't bear to be in the same healthcare system. Others because they can't afford to live where they are. Others because of the politics. I can name you a half dozen, very wealthy Americans that have moved to Singapore in hazmat suits in the last 1 year. And half of them came because of Trumpism, and the other half came because of wokeism. right? So, and I use that as a point for two reasons. One, to illustrate that no two people necessarily see the situation quite the same. And the second is because it gets to Sean's point about politics. And I underemphasized it because one can't generalize about it. But here I do see very massive swings underway, driven by the economics, which Cohen mentioned earlier. The economics drives the politics. I could, if I want to make I don't want to make a confident prediction about this, but I think it's a fairly robust swing that we're about to experience from this conservative notion of hyper-nationalism and xenophobia and borders towards an all-out global war for talent, because the economics says so, because supply and demand says so, because we have aging societies with massive outstanding pension obligations, with not insufficient tax base and not enough young workers. And unless you want a robot that does not yet exist caring for your parents, you are ultimately going to cave in and bring in young people into your country. So that's a pretty massive swing from the way we talk generally and universally about the way politics is today. And of course, the demographics of youth who tend to have more liberal attitudes. So you could have such huge shifts in the politics that one just can't generalize.
Okay, Kun, Sean, so time, when is now, and what happens when within certain regions you have multiple changes happening at once?
Well, I think Parag answered very well, and I just want to say I think it's not now. I think it's yesterday. You know, it's happening already. You know, so and then the other thing is really I think we need to with the politics, but I think the future investment we'll see probably more in the not in addition to digital is probably going to be more on the social infrastructure than civil infrastructure. It's not the road, port, way. I mean, we'll see more social infrastructure related investment should be the government's or the city's priorities.
Kun?
I agree with Parag for to a big extent, but I think maybe there's one thing that might interrupt his thinking, and that is that the thinking is so rational. And what we have seen in the US and also in Europe, but all over the world at the moment, is that the reaction very often is not rational. It is claustrophobic, it is populistic, and there's all kinds of weird emotions coming up. And it turns out that sometimes it's better, if you want to describe humanity, to look at a group of monkeys in the forest and to see how they react than it is to, let's say, go back to the Greek philosophers and try to get some wisdom from that. And what I'm super afraid of is that even in European countries, if you just see the reflexes that are coming up at the moment and about closing borders, and I think totally to what you've said already, what is happening is that people are moving away from Africa, and this has an underlying climate dynamic which is also already happening. And very clearly, Angela Merkel said it, we need the talent coming from those countries. But it's so easy for all kinds of other political parties to then play that game and say, hey, listen, this is crazy, these people are terrorists, etc., etc. And so I think there will be a lot of tension. I think on the long term, you're going to be right. But I think that in between, I just said I'm an optimist, but on the short term, there could be very weird tensions that might lead to wars or conflicts or big problems. And maybe we've seen the beginning of that in the United States. And maybe this is just the beginning of a very unpredictable world going forward.
So Ed Walter has a question. To what degree should a larger nation start to encourage the anticipated migration? Should the US provide incentives by encouraging economic development, lower taxes, et cetera, in the North? So there's that issue. And then, by the way, I would add to that, Parag, you talked about one issue, which is about how we are beginning to understand the value of land. And I'm wondering if the challenge in a way now to really understand where the value of land isn't going to be so much to attract people to move into valuable land, but we may start to track things that we normally think are bad. So inaffordability, congestion as a proxy for attraction. So Ed Walter's question, though, is slightly different, which is, should a large country like the US provide incentives for economic development in the North?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because it's incredibly live right now. Now, I've been trying to find the silver lining in the long deferred infrastructure investment in the United States. We all remember that when Barack Obama was elected in the height of the financial crisis, there was talk of the need for $1 trillion of infrastructure investment, shovel-ready jobs, high-speed railway nationwide. None of that, of course, was done. And now the Biden administration is coming in with an overall current 1.9 trillion package. But as we know, the real emphasis, the abiding long-term plan is infrastructure. But where and what? And one of the things is, if the US has neglected infrastructure for so long, imagine if 12, 15 years ago, we'd started building things that won't be useful infrastructures 5 to 10 years from now. Because in the last 10 years, and again, this is the silver lining I was looking for, we know a lot more about what the impact of climate change is going to be, right down to the microclimates all across the United States. And we also have had a significant energy revolution underway as well in technologies and the cost of alternative renewable technologies. Therefore, when we talk about this Green New Deal, right, part of it should be geographically biased. Not with legislation not done in a typical pork barrel fashion for the sake of allocating funds as if there is no climate change, but rather a strategic thinking about what would be the optimal future human geography of the US. Now, that's some politically sensitive stuff, but let me point out that on a micro level, this is already happening because, as you know, in a number of states, the authorities are no longer allowing, obviously from the financial market standpoint, no longer giving insurance, right, for coastal developments. The Army Corps of Engineers is basically forcing people to move away from certain coastal areas in the Carolinas and elsewhere. They're simply not going to provide public services in certain areas that are considered environmental hazards, and therefore people must move. The grants, the volume of individual grants and buyouts that are going to those residents of those coastal areas, Carolinas, Louisiana, eventually the Florida Keys and elsewhere, those amounts may also increase. So it's literally, now we're already bribing people or incentivizing them to leave places that they should not live and that are no longer going to be habitable. So it's happening on a micro scale, but we need to make a quantum leap to doing it at a kind of macro scale very, very soon, because trillions of dollars are about to go out the door and they should be spent on the right things in the right places.
Well, I think in addition to the right places is really, what kind of infrastructure are we talking about? Again, it's really, I mean, to me, rather than traditional, civil infrastructure, we should really much more aggressive on the digital infrastructure, and much more aggressive on the social infrastructure. So that's my few 2 cents.
Can I throw in?
Go ahead.
I think there's a whole layer that's fascinating on place-based infrastructure. There's a very intelligent level of knowledge. Locus is a group of developers, transit-oriented developers who are inside Smart Growth America. The director of Locus is now the Assistant Deputy Secretary of Transportation for Policy, Christopher Coase. The work that they've done since 2016, the adoption of funding for infrastructure that's close to transit or a rail or cargo. We've seen in Washington, D.C., maybe there were 3 walkable urban districts 15 years ago. Now there are 43. That kind of knowledge base we didn't have 20 years ago, professionally in our own profession, our own practice, and in real estate. And now we do. Place-based strategies exist inside many federal agencies, whether it's Department of Labor or Department of library grants you can get for makerspace. So place-based modular understanding of how to plan infrastructure, and then you respond to that infrastructure with investment. The opportunity zones kind of got close to that, but they did not really reflect neighborhood, district, and urban planning units that
Mm.
tend to be glossed over when we talk about macro systems.
Right. Thank you, Laura. A big champion of successful urbanization. Two other questions. Richard Kaiser.
Neighbor scale.
Yeah. Well, so Richard wants to know, what is the future of cities like Houston, Dallas, and Phoenix that are already unbearably hot in the summer? And then another question from Brian Klinksek. All the green areas on Parag's map are beautiful, idyllic, but the scale of migration that's required and the socioeconomic disparities signal a huge risk. So how do the residents in those beautiful green hills feel about the population of Dhaka moving in? So what do we do about evolved cities that are actually unbearable now? And what do we do about beautiful green areas that have the left side of Dhaka moving in?
Maybe I'll make a brief comment on both of those, but I know when it comes to, if people are not going to move from cities that are, overheating, there are technological solutions that Cone can speak a lot about. And, one talks here is already about plans, and I would want to emphasize the word plans in places like Dubai or Riyadh to build kind of domed cities. There are obviously lower tech ways, in fact, of cooling the urban environment. Here in Singapore, there's a lot of work that Sean surely knows about cooling the heat island, right? A lot of the excess temperature in a place like this is owing to our own industrial activity and the timing of that activity in urban design. So some of this stuff could be mitigated even as temperatures rise. But for cities like that, let's remember one fundamental variable: water, right? So in the southwest of the United States, if there isn't sufficient water generation, right, desalination, piping, all of these other kinds of tools, then those places ultimately do become uninhabitable. So again, this is just another one of those specific geographic examples of the irony of populations growing in places where resources are less plentiful. A place like Houston, has significant floods and doesn't have enough drainage, capacity, and the sort of tropical storms are getting worse and worse in the Gulf of Mexico. So we can go place by place. Quick point about the population of Dhaka moving into Russia, is sort of shorthand for the question. Again, that's not entirely sort of how it works. It's a crazy scenario to ponder. It is actually one that I do ponder in my forthcoming book. But again, these things don't happen all at once, right? A diaspora from a country goes to many places, right? And plenty of Bangladeshis are already among the largest diasporas in a place like Britain, right? Owing to post-colonial ties. You'll see Bangladeshis move into Myanmar. One of the climate oasis zones that I identified in the book is a country that's in the news today because of its coup, which is Myanmar. So Myanmar is a absolutely gigantic country. I'm not sure what European country I would necessarily compare it to in size, but it's a very, very large country. And it only has about 70 or 80 million people, relatively concentrated, but it's upland, wooded, hilly areas. And I'm not saying we should suddenly start rapacious deforestation, right? Far from it. However, there are many places in the world where many, many people can live. And Bangladesh happens to border Myanmar in a very, very lengthy way. So the irony is that right now you have the Rohingya refugees that have been pushed out of Myanmar into Bangladesh, but in 10 years, you're gonna have Bangladeshis moving into Myanmar because Myanmar is much more a climate oasis than Bangladesh is. And again, it's the zigzag for two completely different reasons. So let there be no doubt, the planet Earth is more than large enough that just the terrestrial planet Earth has more than enough space for 9 billion of us, right? Unfortunately, it's not going to be 15 or 19 billion anyway. 9 billion, that's it. Plenty of space, right? But the question is then where and how and when and who takes it and the politics and so forth. But we could do it if we were more rational. And of course, you'll have to forgive me for being so rational. Someone has to be in this day and age.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's that's another perfect example of the distinction between a long-term trend and a short-term signal. That distinction, I think to me, one of the biggest ideas that is coming out of the discussion is everything is going to be more about flow than about strict boundaries. I'm going to start to pull this part of our discussions to a close. I wanted to first make one observation, and that is a point that we talked several times about in the last hour, which is this idea of the social contract. And this, we don't have a social contract. We can't possibly even come up with any kind of rational governance unless we understand what are the underlying values. That was Kun's point. And to me, shared experience is probably the first way to get at the underlying value. And we have to, in some way, make some sense of the disruptions and the crises that will always face us, to have a language that acknowledges that there is a kind of sharing of that experience beyond our normal cultural groups or our boundaries. And by the way, I can't think of any better place to have a shared experience and some kind of shared underlying value than a discussion on ULI. And you know, the last discussion that we've had in the last hour is a perfect example of that. We are starting to sort of migrate to a certain core common understanding that would help all of us make decisions moving forward in our investments in our business. So I want to thank Sean. I want to thank Kun and Parag, especially I want to thank you. We all look forward to reading both your past books and what you have coming up for us. We hope to be able to have coffee and dinner with one another very, very soon. So thank you very, very much for that. Thank you for all the broader ULI GEC group and our guests. And I just want to hand this over back to Linda, who's brought us all together for this really, really wonderful, pleasant hour or so. So thank you, Linda.
Thanks, Chris. Awesome. And thanks to all of our esteemed speakers from across the world. I was remiss in mentioning and thanking Kun as well, who is also a member of GEC, a new member. So, you know, the point here, I think one of the key takeaways is that this council and ULI is member-driven, member-led, and content is king. And to the extent that we can continue to push the boundaries in thinking about how we share information and what types of information, we are uniquely in a great situation where this council can pull down all the borders and the boundaries. To your point, Parag, we don't have any kind of geographic boundary, and we should use that to really think about what type of content we need to share amongst ourselves. So Chris, you did an amazing job as always. And Sean, thank you so much. I know it's late, and Parag, it's late. At this point, I just want to mention a couple of housekeeping things. Our next meeting will be, I think, on May 13th in conjunction with the ULI spring meeting. It will be a virtual meeting. I can assure you the content that is being planned for that is already off the charts. So members and guests are always welcome to join us for that. All of the questions that were curated in the chat, we will pull together and we will try and disseminate and share the recording in some sort of summary of our discussion here this morning and this evening. And then finally, I will also add that right after the spring meeting, I think 2 or 3 weeks later is a ULI Asia Pacific Summit. And I know on the heels of the spring meeting that we'll have in May, we are potentially thinking about a session in conjunction with our colleagues at the Asia PAC meeting. That will be a hybrid meeting. I know many of us will not make it to Tokyo, but we are a global council and we should continue to meet and invite guests and colleagues from each of the geographies. For those of you who missed our prior session, it was on sub-Saharan Africa to a large extent. It received enormous interest. We don't frequently discuss Africa. You know, anyone on this call who has suggestions for content, who would like to push our buttons, the leadership team is very open to sharing that information and that knowledge. Parag, I did order your book. It's a big read. I am a little, you know, in its infancy of starting it, but your collection is fascinating. I encourage everyone to really read and share some of the insights that Parag has shared with us today. Cohen, you write and produce incredible information. Many of you are familiar with edge technologies. I think, Bob, aren't you located in an edge building? Do you want to chat about that? And you're on mute.
On double mute, actually.
Double mute, there you go.
Yeah, we're in an edge building in Amsterdam. Spectacular building. Not sure the age of it anymore because it's been a couple of years since I've been there. It's probably what, 5, 6, 7 years old now, I think. And so the technology probably is a little dated compared to some of what's out there today. I know we went through a refresh of some of the data collection and data ownership and that sort of thing probably 3 years ago or so, maybe 4.
Awesome.
And as we all got smarter about the value of that data and how that data could possibly be used to, enhance the experience of the people working in the building.
Thank you. Thanks, Bob. And at this point, also want to thank Sean from
Thank you.
APAC. Sean, I know you are super committed and a global governing trustee, a senior leader of ULI in the Asia Pac region. A number of us have had the opportunity to listen to you and to follow you as well. And you guys are doing an amazing job.
Thank you.
Some of the incredible initiatives and technology innovations coming out of that region. So at this point, I'll just open up to a general chat. If anyone wants to stay on and connect with their fellow members, feel free. If you want to go into breakout sessions, we can do that. We didn't really plan that because we have a hard stop today, but I know this is not a shy bunch. So, so I'm going to call on someone if I don't see someone. You can ask a question to the panelists. Jay, thanks for joining. I know you're jumping off. How about, who would like to jump in, ask anything? Someone we don't hear about. How about from a guest? Any of our guests? Anas, you're in Dubai. Can you join? Do you want to unmute and say hi to the group? Tell us what's going on in your region.
Hi everyone. Everything is good here. Thank you. It was a fantastic talk. Always excited to to listen to the speakers, and Parag, I've been actually specifically looking forward to hearing you. I mean, I just opened up the link to the book on Amazon, so I'm ordering it. I'm just between getting the Kindle copy or the real copy. So that's my only debate right now.
Yeah, I hear you.
Kindle copy. The maps come out much better in the hardcover.
Yeah, that's why. But I just have to wait a bit longer. That's the only problem. But otherwise, things are good on our side.
Great.
I think the only I think from last time we discussed that things were open for business, there has been a lot of pulling back from that. There's a big exhibition that was I think it's scheduled for end of this month, so that might actually end up being canceled because I'm not sure the world is ready yet for big exhibitions.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Roberto, you want to opine or jump in from South America, right?
Yes, thank you for this invitation. I'm very pleased to participate here. I'm just thinking about in Chile, we live a major social uprising in October 2019, and it was a kind of big transformation. Now we are rewriting a new constitution. Everything is happening, but at the same time, the underlying conditions are in Chile. I think they are very present everywhere. I think that this is when we were leaving the social unrest, we thought that was a kind of unique moment, but with the coronavirus is we are living this overlap crisis. I think it's very interested for people interested in cities and territories to be aware of these processes, and I'm very pleased to participate in this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberto. Any of our colleagues out of Europe, being that this is a European session, anyone in France? I know I saw a couple of the folks in France who would like to opine or jump in, or Vanessa, where are you based? Are you in London? Would you like to jump in?
I am. No, thank you for letting me join today. It's been a really interesting conversation. I've read Prague's book, Connectivity. I'm a big fan. I think the question that I would have, and it's probably around the fact that Generation Alpha might be slightly smaller. I don't know if it's just lockdown, but it seems like there is a lot of people having children right now, or due to be having children. And I just wonder if that theory that it will be a smaller generation will stand in the next few years based off of the past 9 months.
It's a great question. So, many countries literally thought that they could engineer a baby boom given the existing fertility crisis, which has already, again, impacted the likely trajectory of Generation Alpha being small. There was already significant concerns. And of course, what we found is that it didn't really work. But most evidence suggests, anecdotally, if you're in East Berlin, yes, probably a steady rate of childbirth. But in the United States, Brookings just put out a paper a couple of weeks ago saying that they expect about 300,000 fewer children to be born in the United States in the year 2021. That's a staggering drop off. So that's the prediction. It's likely to be based upon what they see in terms of reported births. So I think that the baby bust, sort of, especially given, if you go back, if you want to take the financial crisis, which quite frankly, economically now pales in comparison to the COVID-induced financial, ruin, there was a huge baby bust after 2008 as well, between 2008 and 2009, which is why demographers and economists have been saying for a few years already that in the year 2026, a lot of American colleges are just going to go bankrupt, because literally there will be a massive drop off of the number of 18-year-olds in the year 2026, because far fewer were born in the year 2009. Like, that's how well we can see these things, this like sort of slow moving train wreck demographically. So I have literally, what you've just said is the first time in the last 1 year I've heard anyone say that they're seeing a lot of babies being born. It might just be one particular lucky day. What happened 9 months ago this week? It wasn't Valentine's Day, because that's coming up next week. It must be something else. It must be the arrival of spring or something like that.
Oh, that's great. We have one quick question, and then we'll just wrap it up, if that's okay. Do you have time for one question? Brian, do you want to run a question to either Parag, Sean, or Cohen?
Yeah, thanks, Linda and Parag. It's good to see you again. I remember we did a ULI Asia Pacific webinar in the sort of depths of lockdown 1.0, and it's sort of disappointing that almost a year later we're still doing all these little virtual boxes instead of traveling to see you speak somewhere, you come to us or whatever. And I was, of course, very honored to have my much less insightful commentary elevated by being put on the same panel with you, Parag. But one of my questions, I've asked a couple questions in the chat, and you've answered them about the flows of people and the political consequences and risks associated with that. And I'm quite discouraged in general about global politics and geopolitics. And, Linda, you asked about the situation in Europe. And as many of you know, I'm kind of boomeranged back to London after my Hong Kong stint. So I'm back here and have the kind of weird experience of having myself migrated around the world a couple times during this pandemic. But what's playing out now in Europe that's really remarkable is the first kind of post-Brexit spat, if you will, the first row after Brexit, is this like rich world manifestation of vaccine nationalism, that the continental Europe, that the European Union, which bought the vaccines together, are kind of fighting it out with the UK about maybe we're going to hold back doses that were made here that were meant for the UK and vice versa. And I'm just curious what thoughts that you might have on that, because I find that to be very troubling development, and one that discourages me about the prospects of getting the poor countries vaccinated. And as we know, the evolutionary pressure on the virus to mutate, to evade immunity and vaccines is occurring in places like South Africa and Amazonia and Brazil, where the attack rate was already quite high. So people had this pre-existing immunity, and that kind of really opens up us to the risk of that happening faster. So that was a big question and a big statement.
Big question, and sadly you only have about a minute. I'm so sorry, Parag, but we'd love to just hear if you have anything or...
The vaccine nationalism is sort of, a term coined to apply to what's happening in Europe right now, which we know has a lot to do with the politics of the negotiations between the EU and pharma companies, and then, obviously just market distortions and failures. So it isn't necessarily representative of what could have been in terms of an efficient rollout, given the volume of our capacity to produce vaccines. So I feel like, maybe it's less representative of some underlying political pathos than just of the ineptitude of governance surrounding the vaccine. At least that would be like a charitable interpretation. But perhaps Koen has more insight into it, given the European locus of this issue.
I learned one thing, Parag, and that is that every crisis has two effects. And we saw that in 2008 when Lehman went bankrupt. Of course, it was a financial crisis, but then in no time we had a bigger crisis in Europe. And I'm super afraid that this crisis shows us that the European Union might not be as effective as we were all hoping it would be. And there might be a big repercussion. There's elections coming up, and I can tell you that right-wing parties in Germany and in the Netherlands are really getting their knives out and saying, this is this great European bureaucracy that we created, and what is it bringing us? And so there might be second-order effects coming along, and nationalism might be a big part of that.
Sean, any last comments on that perspective out of Asia?
Well, that's a big subject.
Big summary.
No. I think that's, to me, I think that's probably the most fundamental, elements of this, the topic we're talking about, and then to a certain degree, I still believe, and I remain positive or optimistic for the future, particularly the younger generations, and then I think they're going to be smart, and then they're going to have a more proactive way to drive their future than before.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone.
I suggest we keep in mind there's room for all of us. Let's make it work.
Yeah,
that's right. Oh, absolutely.
That was
absolutely.
All right. So thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Really deep gratitude to everyone. Parag, Sean, Koen, and Chris. Thank you so much, gentlemen.